The lights of Hollywood have always had a way of making people believe in magic. In the late 1970s, those lights shone particularly bright for a young woman who had spent her entire life dreaming of becoming an actress. She wasn't a household name yet, but everyone who knew her said she was on her way. She had that special something that couldn't be taught in acting classes or learned from books. When she walked into a room, people noticed. She had moved to Los Angeles 5 years earlier with nothing but 2 suitcases and a heart full of hope. Like thousands of other young people, she believed Hollywood would be her ticket to a better life. The early days were tough. She worked as a waitress during the day, rushing to auditions whenever she could get time off. At night, she studied scripts and practiced her lines in the tiny apartment she shared with 2 other aspiring actresses. The rent was always late, the refrigerator was usually empty, but somehow that didn't matter. She was chasing a dream, and that made everything worthwhile. Her big break came in 1975 when she landed a small role in a popular television series. It was only 3 episodes, but it was enough to get her noticed. The camera loved her, and more importantly, audiences loved her. She had a warmth that came through the screen, a genuine quality that made viewers feel like they knew her personally. After that first television appearance, the phone started ringing more often. Her agent began getting her auditions for bigger roles. She appeared in commercials, did guest spots on other shows, and even landed a supporting role in a movie that did reasonably well at the box office. By early 1978, she was right on the edge of real success. She had just finished filming what everyone involved believed would be a breakthrough project. The director had praised her performance, telling her she had a natural talent that reminded him of the great actresses of Hollywood's golden age. She left that set feeling like everything she had worked for was finally coming together. At 26 years old, she felt like her life was just beginning. Those who knew her during those final months remembered her as being happier than ever. She had recently signed with a better talent agency, one that represented some of the biggest names in the business. They were confident they could take her career to the next level. She had started making enough money to afford her own apartment, a modest 1-bedroom place in a neighborhood near Hollywood Boulevard. It wasn't fancy, but it was hers. She decorated it with posters from her favorite movies and filled it with plants she tried her best to keep alive. Her friends described her as the kind of person who lit up every gathering. She had a laugh that was infectious and a way of making everyone feel included. On weekends, she would host small dinner parties in her apartment, cooking simple meals and filling the rooms with music and conversation. She loved old jazz records and would dance around her living room, pulling reluctant friends up to join her. She sent letters home to her family regularly, always positive, always optimistic about what was coming next. But beneath the bright surface, there were complications in her personal life that not everyone knew about. She had been in a relationship that those close to her quietly worried about. The man she was dating had a temper that sometimes flared without warning. Friends had noticed bruises she tried to cover with makeup. When they asked about them, she always had an explanation ready. She fell during a rehearsal, she bumped into a door. She was just clumsy. They wanted to believe her, but something felt wrong. In the early months of 1978, several people noticed she seemed more anxious than usual. She would jump at sudden noises. Sometimes during conversations, her mind would drift away, and she would get a faraway look in her eyes. Her roommate from her waitressing days ran into her at a coffee shop one afternoon and was struck by how different she seemed. The confident, bubbly young woman she remembered had been replaced by someone who seemed nervous and distracted. When asked if everything was okay, she forced a smile and said she was just tired from work. The last confirmed sighting of her was on a Tuesday evening in March. She had gone to a meeting with her agent to discuss some upcoming auditions. The meeting went well, and her agent later told police that she seemed excited about several projects they had discussed. She left the office around 6 in the evening, telling her agent she would call him the next day. She stopped at a grocery store near her apartment and bought a few items. The clerk who rang up her purchase remembered her because she was friendly and chatted about the beautiful weather they were having. After that, she simply vanished. When she didn't show up for an important audition 2 days later, her agent tried calling her repeatedly. The phone rang and rang with no answer. He called her apartment building manager, who agreed to check on her. The manager knocked on her door but got no response. Using his master key, he opened the door to find the apartment exactly as she had left it. The groceries she had purchased were still on the kitchen counter, some of the fresh produce already starting to spoil. Her purse was gone, but everything else seemed normal. There were no signs of struggle, no indication that anything was wrong. Her car was discovered that same day parked on a quiet residential street about 2 miles from her apartment. The keys were still in the ignition. Her sunglasses were on the dashboard. The driver's seat was adjusted to her height. It looked like she had simply gotten out and walked away, planning to return in a few minutes, but she never came back. The police were notified, and what would become one of Hollywood's most baffling disappearances officially began. Detectives searched her apartment thoroughly, looking for anything that might explain where she had gone. They found her calendar, which showed she had marked several upcoming auditions with little stars. Her clothes were all there. Her makeup and toiletries were in the bathroom. The script she had been studying for her next audition was on her nightstand, with her handwritten notes in the margins. Everything pointed to someone who had every intention of continuing with her normal life. There was no farewell letter, no indication she was planning to leave. Her bank account showed a modest balance with no unusual withdrawals. She hadn't bought a bus ticket or plane ticket. She hadn't told anyone she was going anywhere. One day she was there, living her life and chasing her dreams. The next day it was as if she had simply ceased to exist. The news of her disappearance spread quickly through Hollywood. Fellow actors and crew members she had worked with were shocked and frightened. If this could happen to her, it could happen to anyone. The story made local newspapers, and tips started coming in. People claimed they had seen her at restaurants, shopping malls, bus stations. But every lead went nowhere. Every reported sighting turned out to be someone else. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks turned into months, the terrible reality began to set in. Something had gone very, very wrong. And somewhere, the truth about what happened that March evening was waiting to be discovered. The detective assigned to the case was a veteran with 20 years on the force. He had seen plenty of missing persons cases before, but something about this one bothered him from the start. Most people who disappear leave some kind of trail, some hint about where they might have gone or why, but this young actress had left behind nothing except questions. He started with the basics, interviewing everyone who had seen her in the days before she vanished. Her agent, her friends, people she had worked with, even the grocery store clerk who sold her those items that spoiled on her kitchen counter. Everyone told him the same thing. She seemed fine, maybe a bit stressed, but nothing out of the ordinary. She was focused on her career and excited about her future. Nobody could imagine why she would suddenly leave without telling anyone. The boyfriend became the detective's primary focus almost immediately. In cases like these, the answer usually lies close to home. The boyfriend was a few years older, worked in construction, and had a reputation around town that made people uncomfortable. Bar owners knew him as someone who drank too much and got aggressive when he did. His previous girlfriend had moved out of state suddenly, and when detectives tracked her down, she was reluctant to talk. Eventually, she admitted he had hurt her more than once. She had left in the middle of the night, too afraid to confront him directly. When brought in for questioning, the boyfriend seemed nervous but not particularly worried. He told detectives he and the actress had been together for about 8 months. They had fights sometimes, sure, but nothing serious. He claimed he last saw her 3 days before she disappeared. They had gone to dinner, had an argument about something he couldn't quite remember, and she had driven home alone. He said he tried calling her the next day, but she didn't answer. He figured she was still upset and needed space. The detective didn't believe him. His story had small inconsistencies that kept changing each time he told it. First, he said they argued about her career. Then he said it was about money. Then he couldn't remember what the argument was about at all. The detective pushed harder, but without evidence, there was nothing he could do. They searched the boyfriend's apartment and found nothing unusual. They looked at his work records and confirmed he had been at a construction site the day she vanished. Several co-workers vouched for him being there all day. Detectives also discovered the boyfriend had sold his truck about a week after she disappeared. When they tracked down the person who bought it, they found the truck had been thoroughly cleaned inside and out. Too clean, the detective thought. But cleaning a vehicle isn't a crime, and without any physical evidence connecting it to the disappearance, it proved nothing. As weeks passed, other theories began to emerge. Some people suggested she had simply run away to escape the pressures of Hollywood. The entertainment industry could be cruel, especially to young women trying to make it. Maybe she got tired of the rejection. The competition, the constant struggle. Maybe she decided to start over somewhere else with a new identity. But this theory didn't hold up under scrutiny. She had been succeeding, not failing. Her career was on the rise. Why would she abandon everything right when her dreams were coming true? Another theory involved the darker side of Hollywood. In the 1970s, there were whispers about dangerous people who preyed on young actresses. Stories circulated about parties where things happened that nobody talked about afterward. Some investigators wondered if she had gotten mixed up with the wrong crowd, seen something she shouldn't have seen, or rejected someone powerful who didn't take rejection well. But again, there was no evidence to support any of this. It was all speculation and rumor. Her family arrived from out of state, desperate for answers. Her mother was a strong woman who refused to believe her daughter would simply walk away from her life. She knew her daughter better than anyone, and she knew something terrible had happened. She set up a command center in a motel room, covering the walls with maps and photographs. She spent her days walking the streets, showing her daughter's picture to everyone she met. She spoke to homeless people, shop owners, gas station attendants. Had anyone seen her? Did anyone know anything? The mother appeared on local television news programs pleading for information. She offered a reward with money she didn't have, hoping someone would come forward. Tips started flooding in. The police investigated each one, but they all led nowhere. Someone saw a woman who looked like her at a bus station in Arizona. Another caller insisted she was working as a waitress in Nevada. A psychic called to say she was still alive but being held against her will. None of it was true. Months turned into a year. The detective kept working the case, but other investigations demanded his attention. The boyfriend had moved to another state, claiming he needed a fresh start away from all the suspicion and questioning. Some people thought this proved his guilt, but others argued that innocent people also get tired of being accused. Without a body, without witnesses, without any concrete evidence of foul play, the case slowly went cold. By 1980, the story had largely faded from the news. Occasionally, a magazine would run a "Whatever Happened to" article, featuring her alongside other mysterious disappearances. True crime enthusiasts debated theories in the early days of internet forums. Some became obsessed with solving the case, creating elaborate timelines and conspiracy theories. But for most people, she became just another sad statistic, another young woman who vanished without a trace. Her mother never stopped searching. She spent every penny she had hiring private investigators, following leads that police had abandoned, keeping her daughter's case alive any way she could. She started a support group for families of missing persons, finding some comfort in helping others who understood her pain. On her daughter's birthday each year, she would place an advertisement in the Los Angeles Times with her daughter's photograph and a message. "We love you. We're still looking. Please come home." The actress's friends tried to move on with their lives, but they never forgot her. At Hollywood parties, when people shared stories about the industry, someone would occasionally mention her name. "Remember her? Whatever happened to her?" And the conversation would fall silent for a moment, everyone thinking about how fragile life could be, how quickly someone could disappear. Her apartment was eventually rented to someone else. Her belongings, held by police as potential evidence, were finally released to her family. Her mother packed everything carefully, unable to throw away any piece of her daughter's life. The clothes still smelled faintly of her perfume. The script still had her handwritten notes. The photograph showed a young woman full of life and hope, frozen forever at 26 years past. The detective who had worked her case eventually retired, the file still unsolved on his desk when he cleaned out his office. He thought about her often, especially on quiet nights. He had failed to find her, failed to give her family answers, and it haunted him. He wasn't alone. Everyone who had known her carried that same weight, that same unanswered question. What happened that March evening in 1978? Where did she go after she parked her car on that quiet street? The truth was out there somewhere, buried in time, waiting to be discovered. But for now, all anyone had was silence and the terrible not knowing that came with it. The 1980s arrived, and with them came new headlines, new scandals, and new mysteries that pushed old stories further into the background. The actress who had disappeared became a footnote, a tragic tale that people mentioned occasionally but rarely investigated. Her missing person file gathered dust in a storage room alongside hundreds of other unsolved cases. Life in Los Angeles moved forward as it always does, indifferent to the unanswered questions left behind. Her mother aged quickly during those years. The stress and heartbreak carved lines into her face that hadn't been there before. She continued her advocacy work for missing persons, channeling her grief into something productive. She testified before lawmakers about the need for better systems to track missing people. She fought for databases that could connect cases across state lines. She refused to let her daughter's disappearance be meaningless. If she couldn't bring her daughter home, at least she could help other families find theirs. The support group she had started grew larger than anyone expected. Every week, a dozen or more people would gather in a community center sharing their stories and their pain. There were parents whose children had vanished, siblings who had lost brothers and sisters, friends who couldn't let go. They brought photographs and flyers, hope and despair in equal measure. The meetings always ended the same way, with everyone holding hands in a circle, saying the names of the missing out loud, keeping their memory alive through the simple act of speaking. In Hollywood, the actress became something of an urban legend. New arrivals to the city would hear her story as a cautionary tale. Be careful who you trust. Watch your back. Don't go anywhere alone at night. Her face appeared in documentaries about unsolved mysteries, always with the same grainy photograph from her last headshot session. That image became iconic in a way she never could have imagined. Preserved forever at 26, forever smiling at the camera with hope in her eyes. The boyfriend had indeed moved away, settling in another state where nobody knew his history. He got married, had children, and worked steady construction jobs. People who knew him there thought he was just a regular guy, maybe a bit rough around the edges, but nothing unusual. He never talked about his past, and nobody thought to ask. The detective who had questioned him so many years ago would sometimes wonder what happened to him, whether he was living with guilt or sleeping soundly at night. But without evidence, all the detective could do was wonder. Meanwhile, in a quiet neighborhood not far from where the actress had once lived her final days, ordinary life continued in all its mundane glory. The street where her car had been found saw new families move in and out of the modest homes. Children rode bicycles on the sidewalks. People mowed their lawns on Saturday mornings and waved to neighbors they barely knew. Nobody who lived there had any idea they were walking over one of Hollywood's darkest secrets. One particular house on that street had changed hands several times over the years. It was a simple single-story home with a small front yard and a larger backyard that nobody did much with. The first family who bought it after 1978 lived there for 5 years before relocating for work. The second family stayed even less time. Houses in Los Angeles were always turning over, people coming and going with the rhythm of job opportunities and broken dreams. In 1992, a young couple bought the house. They were excited about becoming homeowners even if the place needed work. The interior was dated with wallpaper from the 1960s and appliances that barely functioned. But they had plans. They would renovate slowly, room by room, making it their own. They planted flowers in the front yard and talked about maybe building a deck in the back someday. Their children played in that backyard, running through the grass completely unaware of what lay beneath their feet. The neighborhood itself was unremarkable. Working-class families, retirees, a few renters mixed in with homeowners. People kept to themselves mostly, the way people do in big cities. There was a small market on the corner where everyone bought milk and bread. A park 2 blocks away where kids played baseball in the summer. Nothing about the area suggested it held any dark secrets. It was just another Los Angeles neighborhood where people lived their lives and minded their own business. During these years, advances in forensic science were changing the way investigators approached cold cases. DNA analysis became more sophisticated. Computer databases made it easier to connect evidence across different cases. Police departments started forming cold case units, taking another look at mysteries that had been abandoned years earlier. Some families began getting answers they had waited decades to hear. Bodies were identified. Killers were caught. Justice, delayed but not denied, finally arrived for some. The actress's mother followed these developments closely. She read every article about new forensic techniques, attended conferences about missing persons investigations, and regularly contacted the police department to ask if they were using these new methods to look at her daughter's case. The answers were always polite but disappointing. Yes, they still had the file. No, there were no new leads. They would certainly let her know if anything changed. But resources were limited, and there were so many cases, so many families waiting for answers. By the late 1990s, the mother's health began to fail. The decades of stress had taken their toll on her body. She developed heart problems and had to slow down her advocacy work. But she never stopped hoping. She kept her daughter's room exactly as it had been. Like a shrine to a life interrupted, she would sit in there sometimes, holding clothes that no longer smelled like anything, looking at photographs of a future that never happened. 20 years had passed and still no answers. Still no closure. Still no peace. Her daughter would have been in her 40s by then if she was still alive. The mother sometimes tried to imagine what she might look like with some gray in her hair, maybe with laugh lines around her eyes. Would she have stayed in acting or moved on to something else? Would she have gotten married, had children of her own? These thoughts were both comforting and unbearably painful. The life that could have been existed only in imagination now, a ghost of possibility haunting every quiet moment. The case file sat in storage, one folder among thousands. Inside were witness statements, photographs of her abandoned car, notes from interviews that had gone nowhere. The detective who had worked the case had long since retired. The boyfriend had disappeared into ordinary life. The actress's friends had scattered across the country, pursuing their own dreams or giving up on Hollywood entirely. Time had moved on, the way it always does, covering old tragedies with layers of new ones. But the truth hadn't gone anywhere. It was still there, waiting in the darkness, patient and unchanging. In that quiet neighborhood where children played and families lived their normal lives, the earth held its secrets close. The ground remembered what people had forgotten. And as the new millennium approached, circumstances were aligning that would finally bring those secrets into the light. The young couple who owned the house, where the actress's car had been found nearby, were about to make a decision that would change everything. They had been saving money for years, and they had finally decided it was time for a major renovation. They wanted to add value to their property and create the backyard oasis they had always dreamed of. They contacted several construction companies to get quotes for their project. They wanted to dig deep into their yard and install something that would transform their outdoor space completely. They had no idea what they were about to uncover. Nobody did. The neighborhood was quiet that spring, just like it had been for 22 years. But that quiet was about to be shattered in a way that nobody could have predicted. The past was about to collide with the present, and one of Hollywood's oldest mysteries was finally about to be solved. The morning of May 15, 2000, started like any other day in the quiet neighborhood. The sun rose over Los Angeles, casting long shadows across yards where sprinklers had just finished their early cycle. People were getting ready for work, drinking coffee, checking the traffic reports on television. Nobody expected this day to be different from any other. Nobody knew that within a few hours, everything would change. The construction crew arrived at the house around 8 in the morning. There were 4 of them, experienced workers who had done hundreds of similar jobs. The homeowners had hired them to install an in-ground swimming pool, a luxury they had saved years to afford. The crew unloaded their equipment, marked out the area where the pool would go, and fired up the excavator. It was supposed to be a straightforward job, maybe 2 weeks of work from start to finish. The operator climbed into the excavator and began digging. The machine's powerful arm tore into the earth, scooping up dirt and depositing it in a growing pile at the edge of the property. For the first hour, everything went exactly as planned. The soil was relatively soft, which made the work easier. The operator was already thinking this might be one of the smoother jobs he had done in a while. Then around mid-morning, something changed. The excavator's bucket scraped against something that didn't feel like rock or root. The operator had enough experience to know when something was off. He stopped the machine, climbed down, and walked over to examine what he had uncovered. At first he thought maybe it was an old blanket or tarp that had been buried years ago. People sometimes buried trash in their yards before garbage collection became regular. He knelt down for a closer look, using his gloved hand to brush away some of the loose dirt. That's when he saw it. Fabric, yes, but not just any fabric. There was a pattern to it, faded but still visible. And there was something else, something that made his stomach drop. He stood up quickly, his face suddenly pale despite the warm morning sun. He called over his crew chief, trying to keep his voice steady. The crew chief took one look and immediately pulled out his cell phone. His hands were shaking as he dialed. Within minutes, the construction site had transformed into something else entirely. The workers stood back from the excavation area, none of them wanting to look too closely at what they had found but unable to look away either. The first police officers arrived within 15 minutes. They cordoned off the area with yellow tape, the bright plastic looking strangely out of place in the suburban setting. Neighbors began emerging from their houses, curious about the sudden commotion. What was happening? Was there a gas leak? Some kind of accident? The officers weren't saying much, just asking people to stay back and let them do their work. Within an hour, the quiet street was filled with official vehicles. Patrol cars, unmarked detective sedans, a crime scene investigation van, even the coroner's vehicle. The homeowners had been at work when all this started, and they received a phone call they would never forget. They needed to come home immediately. No, nothing was wrong with the house. No, there hadn't been an accident. Just please come home right away. A forensic team took over, working with careful precision. They couldn't just dig everything up quickly. Every inch of soil had to be documented, photographed, examined. They erected a tent over the excavation site to shield it from view and protect the scene from the elements. Neighbors watched from their windows and front porches, speculation running wild. Someone said they saw what looked like bones. Another person claimed the police had found buried treasure. Nobody knew the truth yet, but everyone sensed that something significant was happening. The forensic anthropologist arrived in the early afternoon. She was a specialist who had worked on dozens of cases involving remains discovered long after death. She climbed down into the excavation area, moving with practiced care, examining what the construction crew had accidentally uncovered. She worked for hours, occasionally emerging to confer with detectives, then returning to her meticulous documentation. As the day wore on, the truth became increasingly clear to the investigators. They had found human remains, buried in a shallow grave that had gone undiscovered for more than 2 decades. The body had been wrapped in material that had partially deteriorated over the years. The forensic team carefully excavated around the remains, looking for any evidence that might have been buried with them. Every piece of dirt was sifted, every fragment examined. The news media caught wind of the story by late afternoon. Television trucks began arriving, setting up their cameras at the edge of the police perimeter. Reporters spoke in hushed, serious tones to their cameras, explaining that authorities had discovered human remains during a routine construction project. They were careful with their words, not wanting to speculate, but the implications were clear. This was not a recent death. Someone had been buried here for a very long time. Inside the command post that had been set up in the homeowner's living room, detectives were already working through possibilities. They pulled records of everyone who had lived in the house over the past 30 years. They looked at missing persons reports from the area going back decades. They contacted the retired detective who had worked missing persons cases in the late 70s and early 80s. Did he remember any cases that might fit? Any disappearances in this neighborhood? The old detective, now in his 70s, felt a chill run down his spine when he got the call. He had carried several unsolved cases with him into retirement, faces that haunted his quiet moments. He drove to the scene that same evening, his presence not officially required but personally necessary. He stood at the police tape looking at the tent covering the excavation site and felt the weight of decades pressing down on him. The forensic work continued into the night under portable lights. The team worked with intense focus, knowing that every detail mattered. They found small items buried with the remains, pieces of jewelry, fragments of clothing, items that had survived the years underground. Each discovery was carefully documented and preserved. These weren't just artifacts. They were potential evidence in what was clearly a homicide investigation. The remains were finally removed from the site in the early hours of the next morning, transported to the medical examiner's office where more detailed analysis could be performed. The excavation area was left open, still cordoned off, still under guard. The investigation was just beginning, but already it was clear this was something significant. By dawn, the story was everywhere. National news picked it up. Headlines screamed about the mysterious discovery in a quiet Los Angeles neighborhood. The homeowners, shocked and overwhelmed, checked into a hotel, unable to stay in a house that had become a crime scene. Their dream renovation had turned into a nightmare, though they understood that whatever they were going through was nothing compared to what someone else had endured. In the medical examiner's office, forensic experts began their careful analysis. They would extract DNA, examined the remains for signs of trauma, used dental records to attempt identification. They had methods and technology now that hadn't existed in the 70s. What might have remained a mystery decades ago could now be solved with science and patience. And hundreds of miles away, an elderly woman watched the news report with a feeling she couldn't quite name. The story was vague on details, but something about it made her heart race. The location, the estimated time frame. After 22 years of waiting, of hoping, of never giving up, could this finally be the answer she had been searching for? She picked up the phone with trembling hands and dialed the number she had called so many times before. The police department. The missing persons unit? She needed to know if what they found could possibly be her daughter. She needed to know if her decades-long search was finally, terribly coming to an end. The forensic laboratory worked around the clock for 3 days straight. Dental records were compared with meticulous attention to detail. DNA samples were processed using technology that would have seemed like science fiction back in 1978. The medical examiner's team photographed and documented every aspect of the remains, building a comprehensive picture of what had happened all those years ago. On the 4th day, they had their answer. The remains found in that suburban backyard belonged to the missing actress. After 22 years of uncertainty, her family finally knew where she was. The news was delivered to her mother in person by 2 detectives who had rehearsed what they would say, but found their prepared words inadequate when facing a mother's grief. She didn't cry at first. She just sat very still in her living room, the same room where she had coordinated search efforts for more than 2 decades. The walls were still covered with photographs and newspaper clippings, a timeline of a search that had consumed her entire adult life. When the tears finally came, they came in waves, relief mixed with anguish, answers mixed with unbearable loss. Her daughter hadn't run away, hadn't started a new life somewhere else. She had been taken from this world violently, and she had been so close all along, less than 3 miles from her apartment. The medical examiner's findings painted a grim picture. The actress had suffered significant trauma. The evidence pointed clearly to homicide. She had been killed and buried quickly, hidden in a location that seemed random but likely wasn't. The investigation immediately intensified. Detectives pulled out the old case file, now viewing everything through the lens of what they knew now. The property records became crucial. Who had owned that house in 1978? The answer sent the investigation in a direction that wasn't entirely surprising to the retired detective who had worked the original case. The house had been owned by the boyfriend's uncle. The boyfriend himself had been staying there temporarily while working construction in that area. He had access to the property. He had the means and opportunity, and now with the discovery of the body, he had nowhere to hide. Finding him took less than 48 hours. He was living in a small town in another state, still working construction, still living what appeared to be a normal life. When police knocked on his door early one morning, his face showed something the officers would later describe in their reports. Not shock, not confusion, something closer to resignation, as if he had been waiting for this moment for 22 years. The interrogation lasted hours. At first he maintained his innocence, sticking to the story he had told decades earlier. But the evidence was overwhelming now. They had found her body buried at a property he had access to. Forensic analysis showed the grave had been dug with construction tools, the kind he would have been using in his work. The timeline matched perfectly with when she disappeared. Finally, as the sun was setting on that long day of questioning, he broke. The story that came out was tragically simple and brutally senseless. They had argued that night, just as he had admitted years ago, but it had escalated beyond what he had told police. She had tried to end their relationship, told him she was afraid of him, threatened to tell people about the times he had hurt her. His temper had exploded in a way that crossed a line from which there was no return. He had panicked after realizing what he had done. Using his knowledge of construction and access to his uncle's property, he had buried her in the backyard under cover of darkness. He told his uncle he needed to do some work on the property, planted grass over the disturbed earth, and then tried to act as if nothing had happened. He had sold his truck not because it contained evidence, but because every time he looked at it, he remembered using it that night. For 22 years, he had carried this secret. He had moved away, built a new life, convinced himself that it was buried in the past just like she was buried in that yard. He had watched the news stories about her disappearance. He had seen her mother's pleas on television, and he had said nothing, done nothing, hoping that time and silence would protect him forever. The arrest made headlines around the world. The actress's story, which had faded into obscurity, was suddenly everywhere again. Her photograph, that same headshot from 1978, appeared on every news channel and website. People who had never heard of her before learned her story. A new generation discovered the tragedy of a life cut short, just as it was beginning to flourish. The trial took place 8 months later. The courthouse was packed every day with reporters, true crime enthusiasts, and people who felt connected to the story in some way. Her mother attended every session, sitting in the front row, her eyes never leaving the man who had taken her daughter's life. She had aged decades in the years since her daughter's disappearance, but now there was something else in her face alongside the grief. A sense of purpose, of justice finally being within reach. The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming. They presented the forensic evidence, the property records, the timeline that placed him at the scene. They brought in his former girlfriend who testified about his violent temper. They showed how he had fled to another state shortly after the disappearance. And finally, they played the recording of his confession, his voice filling the courtroom with the truth he had hidden for more than 2 decades. The defense tried to argue that the confession had been coerced, that the evidence was circumstantial, that too much time had passed for a fair trial. But none of it worked. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning with their verdict. Guilty of murder. The courtroom erupted in emotion. Some people cried. Others sat in stunned silence. Her mother simply nodded, as if she had known all along that this day would come. The sentencing hearing was held 2 weeks later. The judge listened to impact statements from the actress's family and friends. They spoke about the woman she had been, the dreams she had carried, the light she had brought into the world. They spoke about 22 years of not knowing, of hoping and grieving simultaneously, of the particular torture that comes with unanswered questions. When it was the mother's turn to speak, she stood slowly, her hands gripping the podium for support. Her voice was quiet but steady. She didn't speak to the man who had killed her daughter. She spoke to the court, to the world, to anyone who was listening. She talked about the importance of never giving up, even when hope seems foolish. She talked about the other families still searching for their missing loved ones. She talked about how justice delayed is not justice denied, as long as people keep fighting for truth. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the officers led him away, he glanced back at the courtroom one time. His eyes met those of the mother he had lied to for 22 years. Whatever he saw in her face made him look away quickly and never look back again. The actress was finally laid to rest in a ceremony attended by hundreds of people. Some had known her personally. Others had followed her story for years. Many had never met her but felt compelled to pay their respects. Her mother stood at the graveside, surrounded by the support group she had formed decades earlier. People who understood her pain in ways others never could. The headstone was simple and elegant, bearing her name, her dates, and a single line, "Her light shines on." In the years that followed, her story became part of the broader conversation about missing persons and cold cases. Her mother continued her advocacy work until she passed away peacefully in her sleep 5 years later, finally able to rest knowing her daughter's story had been told. The support group she founded continues to this day, helping families navigate the nightmare of having a loved one disappear. The case also led to changes in how missing persons investigations are handled. Her story became a teaching example in law enforcement training programs. It demonstrated how advances in forensic science could solve cases that seemed impossible. It showed the importance of never closing a case completely, of keeping evidence preserved, of being ready when technology and circumstances finally align to reveal the truth. The actress never got to fulfill her dreams of Hollywood stardom. She never got to see the success that seemed so close in those final days of her life. But in a way she never could have imagined, her story reached more people than any movie role ever would have. She became a symbol of persistence, of justice, of the importance of never forgetting those who vanish. And in that quiet neighborhood where builders made their shocking discovery, life eventually returned to normal. A new family bought the house, fully aware of its history, but choosing to see it differently. They viewed it as a place where truth finally emerged, where secrets could no longer stay buried, where justice proved patient but inevitable. They planted a tree in the backyard, a living memorial to a young woman whose dreams were stolen but whose story would never be forgotten.